We are back with another episode of the Kyle Lanslone Show. I am solo today, but there is an absolute ton of news to talk about and to get through. So I want to jump right into it. Remind people to share the show. If you are watching over on that, subscribe to the YouTube channel. That's where you could help us out the most. If you're watching on YouTube, get in the chat. Let us know what you think. If you got any questions or anything you want me to talk about, any comments on the show, but let's get rolling. I want to talk about cleansing Gaza and Netanyahu's plans. He's made some more statements on that I think are worth breaking down. Netanyahu's new demands for ending the war in Gaza. I think this is very important to break down what's happened here and how deceptive the Americans and the Israelis have been in attempting to pin this all on Hamas. And then a couple of issues dealing with the Ukraine war. Is the U.S. done with Ukraine? And some clips from Lindsey Graham on his thoughts about ending the war too soon and what that means. So let's jump right into it with this clip of Benjamin Netanyahu. This is on Israeli I-24 News. The interview was in Hebrew, so this clip and the next clip were AI generated into English.
But do you really believe that in the end we'll see migration from Gaza?
Oh, about Gaza?
Yes.
I want to ask you a question. What do you mean? What is it? I just don't understand this claim at all. What is it? Gaza should be a closed place, like in all other war zones. In Syria, millions left during the civil war there. In Ukraine, millions left. In Afghanistan, millions left. And suddenly here, it's decided that in Gaza the civilians have to be locked in, instead of giving them the option to leave. First of all, to leave the combat zones, and even to leave the strip entirely if they want. We will allow that, first of all within Gaza, during the fighting. Of course, we will also allow them to leave Gaza. We're not pushing them out, but we are allowing them to leave.
It's happening slowly.
You need the receiving countries. We're talking to several countries. I can't go into detail about that here.
So there's a few elements in here that I really want to break down. And one of the very important ones, I think, is Netanyahu's big lie here. The one major lie he tells in all this, which is the Palestinians should be free to leave and they can't do it. And that's not our fault, when absolutely Israel is preventing everything from getting in and out of Gaza other than the IDF and a small trickle of aid. Netanyahu presents this as, as if the Palestinians could just easily cross over the Egyptian border and have somewhere safe to go if it wasn't for unknown factors, when those factors are the Israeli military. Looking at maps of Gaza right now, Israel has well over half of the strip, I think like 80-something% of the strip, is an active military zone. And this includes all the land borders of Gaza, including the border with Egypt. And so if a Palestinian did truly want to leave and started walking towards the border of Gaza today, they would be shot when they were about a half a kilometer from either the Israeli or the Egyptian border, because these are the Israeli buffer zones. These are the no-go zones for the Palestinians. Additionally, Israel has even prevented the Palestinians from entering the Mediterranean Sea. They've killed over 200 fishermen since this war started. People just out trying to catch a little bit of food for themselves, maybe catch some fish, sell it so they could buy some other food for their family, right? Like, this is what was happening. And the Israelis were killing these people by the hundreds. And now, complete ban on entering the Mediterranean Sea, even though the weather is scorching, that the children are not only starving, but they're overheated, they're sick because they're drinking unclean water, and Israel won't let them into the Mediterranean Sea to bathe and to enjoy life a little bit. And so, no, Netanyahu, they cannot leave. The IDF, the forces at your command, will murder them. They will actually murder them before that happens. Now, an additional part to all this is Netanyahu tries to make it sound like these people are all looking for somewhere to go, that they want to leave, and that really doesn't seem to be the case. The obstacle that Netanyahu points out is that we're looking for a third country to take in the Palestinians, and that certainly is an obstacle for Israel. Now, of course, Netanyahu and the Republican or the pro-Israel talking points on this are, of course, they make it out to be that the Egyptians or the Jordanians don't want to take into the Palestinians because Palestinians cause problem. There's Hamas, there's terrorism. These are just generally speaking bad people that the Egyptians and the Jordanians don't want in their country. When in reality, the Palestinians are people that are going to demand rights, and so they may be seen as politically unadvantageous to the king of Egypt and the military dictator of Egypt, the king of Jordan, the military dictator in Egypt. But that's in no way something bad to say about the Palestinians. Additionally, the leaders of all these countries, their people don't want them to do this, right? The Egyptians, the Egyptian people, the Jordanian people, the Lebanese people, the Syrian people, all these countries that we're going to list that Israel is trying to ship the Palestinians off to, the people of their countries don't want their government to take part in the ethnic cleansing of Gaza. They, by saying that we will take in the Palestinians, you're giving Netanyahu and taking part in this, you're giving him somewhere to send the Palestinians, where they're not going to go willingly. They're either going to go because that's the only place that they could get food, or even more likely, just at the barrel of a gun. Israel will round them up by the thousands, push them onto, I guess they won't be train cars, they'll probably be ships or trucks, where they're going to be sent off to another country somewhere in Africa and dumped in refugee camps where they're, going to be miserable. The best case scenario is maybe some assimilation, but we're talking about really the genocide of the Palestinian people, the destruction, the scattering of the Palestinian people. And that's what Netanyahu's talking about here. Now, what important factor that he leaves out in all of this is it's really not Israel that's trying to negotiate with third countries to take in the Palestinians. It's the U.S. We have a lot to offer. We have a lot of leverage. Now, Israel could give these dictatorial governments access to some high-tech Israeli spyware or maybe some Israeli weapons. Maybe Mossad will help them out with some covert ops. But this is, I think the countries are going to look for a big public return in order to appease their people for this. And this is no doubt going to be funded by Washington, but also likely the bribes are really going to be carried out by Washington, right? If, let's say, the U.S. goes to the opposing Libyan governments and tells both of them, except the Palestinians, maybe one does to skip the scales against the other, they're going to be asking the Americans for military support. The same thing with the civil war situation in Sudan or Somalia, all places that we know there's been conversations about sending the Palestinians to when the Israelis are done with their genocide in Gaza. Also, Syria, there's a lot of leverage that they have over the Syrian government. And I really do think the plan is to spread out the Palestinians. Egypt isn't going to have to take in 2 million Palestinians from Gaza. The Jordanians won't have to take in millions of Palestinians from Gaza from the West Bank. It's going to be dispersed over multiple countries. And I think this is going to help deteriorate and ultimately end the Palestinian culture and the Palestinian people, as they're not going to be a group of people even in any nation anymore, much less their homeland, which is where they want to be. And ultimately, that is the other big deception in all this, is Netanyahu leaving out. The only reason that the Palestinians would want to leave, when I don't even think that there's an overwhelming consensus of Palestinians now that they would want to leave if they were offered it, the only reason they would is because Israel is murdering them 100 people every single day. Day after day after day after day, another 100 people dead, another 100 people dead. And worse, it's hundreds of doctors. It's, as we already said, the fishermen. It's 237 journalists now, right? Even the most renowned Palestinian journalists who are even known on the international stage are just completely murdered by Israel openly, intentionally. They stated it. They said, they made up this thing about Hamas, that this man is guilty. We are going to kill him. And they just get away with it. And so this is, a real major issue here of what Netanyahu is trying to spin, where he's not emphasizing, not acknowledging the Israeli role in making Gaza completely uninhabitable, preventing the aid from coming in. And so I just really want to set the record straight on that, because Israel is getting really heavy into this voluntary migration policy, that we are allowing the Palestinians to leave so they could live happy lives elsewhere where they're not going to be a problem and there's not going to be Hamas. This narrative must be debunked. Now, there's one more thing that Netanyahu explained in that interview, and it's the current Israeli negotiating position with Hamas. And I'll get into how the Israeli leader is distorting the truth. Again, this video is AI generated, translated.
Has the door to a partial deal been closed? Yes or no?
I think you heard President Trump. He said what I also said. I think that's behind us.
Behind us?
It's behind us. We tried. We made all kinds of attempts. We went quite a distance. But it became clear to us that, in the end, they were just stringing us along. And in any case, they would keep many hostages in their hands, both living and deceased. And we want all of them. I want all of them, both the living and the fallen. That's what we're aiming for. And I'm not telling you that I wouldn't be willing to discuss it. I want to bring everyone back as part of ending the war.
One deal.
But under the terms of ending our war. And yesterday I detailed the conditions. I set out 5 conditions, which include disarming Hamas, dismantling Gaza, and other things you saw there. As part of the discussion about our conditions, the release of all the hostages, both living and deceased, as one. Absolutely. That's the stage we're at. Yes, we're not going back.
Okay, so I think there's a couple of really key points in here to break down. The first is that Netanyahu has just completely ruled out talks. This has been reported in Israeli media. I've read this in Ynet and I believe Haaretz as well, that Netanyahu has just decided against talks, and that I think the way the Times of Israel described it, that he was going to try to free the hostages through decisive military force. Now, obviously, if you look at what's happened over the past almost 2 years now during the Israeli onslaught in Gaza, almost every time Israel has tried to rescue their captives, it has ended up with the captives dying, either at the hands of the Israeli forces, who have killed and bombed and gassed their own captives that way, but also by Hamas now having orders to execute any hostages before they're released by Israel. So there's really no practical way for Israel to release the hostages militarily. And this is known by the IDF. The IDF chief of staff has said this, that this is going to endanger the hostages. This is known by the family members of the hostages in Gaza, who have said that they are opposed to what Netanyahu is doing because this is going to endanger their lives of their family members. And the hostages who have gotten out, almost all of which of the hostages who have gotten out have only gotten out through ceasefire deals, phased ceasefire deals, where every week a few hostages are released in exchange for the ceasefire going on and additional humanitarian aid coming into Gaza. And so, as proof, there's about 130 former Israeli captives of Hamas and Palestinian Islamic Jihad who are now alive and living, I guess most of them in Israel, because of these phased ceasefire agreements that Hamas has been willing to go by since the very start of the war. And, you know, when we had the first ceasefire agreement in November of 2023, where we saw 100 hostages released, or the one earlier this year where we had a few dozen hostages released, that this is the way forward. This is how the hostages end up being released from Hamas captivity alive. Now, the next part of this that I really want to get into is there did appear to be some progress made on the ceasefire negotiations that were taking place. I believe they are hosted by Qatar, between Hamas, the Qataris, the Egyptians, kind of representing the Palestinian side, and then you had the US and Israel on the other side. And some progress was being made there. But then Netanyahu withdrew from the talks, and he added this new condition. it cannot be a phased agreement. Hamas must give up all the captives, living and dead, up front. And so Hamas holds about 50 Israelis still, only 30 of them are just bodies, 20 of them are expected to be alive. According to Netanyahu, Hamas must give all of that up front. Now, this is something that Hamas is obviously not going to agree to, because in the past, Israel has broken the ceasefire agreements. They haven't continued to see the release of all their hostages, but instead resumed the war. And so Hamas, I think it's quite reasonable to say, sees a situation where they have to maintain leverage to extend the ceasefire. And so they would release the hostages in small groups to make sure that the Israelis are abiding by it. Because Israel could just as easily break the ceasefire once Hamas has no more hostages, which I've often wondered why. Certainly at this point, by any of the agreements that have been proposed, all the Israeli captives would have been freed if Netanyahu just agreed to it. Why he didn't agree to that, put in a ceasefire, even if it lasted 3 or 6 months, and then go back to war after. I think a part of it is that the truth is that Netanyahu does not want a hostage deal. He wants the hostages to remain in Gaza, to have another excuse to continue to wage war in Gaza. And really, that's the point of Netanyahu's statement there, to set up a bunch of conditions that Hamas is never going to agree to, so Israel could continue to kill and kill and kill in Gaza, and starve people in Gaza, and destroy every house, every hospital, every school that's now been turned into a shelter, and kill all the journalists, all the healthcare workers. They are going to keep doing this because they say Hamas needs to arm, and they have to give up all the hostages at the same time. All right, now I want to shift gears and talk about the war in Ukraine. We had the big summit between Trump and Putin coming up on Friday, and there's been some pretty important developments going on this week. The Europeans are really committed to trying to pressuring the Americans to allow Zelensky to attend the summit, which I believe would cause some problems. And they're also really stating that the deal, which nobody knows the details, nobody knows for sure what Putin is going to bring to the table and what he's going to offer Trump, or what Trump plans to offer Vladimir Putin. Trump has talked about land swapping. Who the hell knows what the president actually means when he says that? There's been reports in the Wall Street Journal that Russia is willing to go back on its demand that it maintain all, or I guess take all of the Kherson and Zaporizhia, the southern oblasts in Ukraine. They only control about half of each of those territories, and were demanding that Ukraine withdraw from the full territory to end the war previously. And so Russia is now just demanding that Ukraine recognize the territory that's currently held by Russian forces as a part of Russia. And then, of course, the Donbass region, where Ukraine still maintains a little bit of territory in Donetsk, but at this point they're losing territory in that region rapidly. And so Russia is asking Ukraine to withdraw from some territory there under the proposal that's supposed to be brought to Alaska, but it's not a significant amount. And then Russia wouldn't maintain any other Ukrainian territory that they currently control. I think there's some in Kharkiv and others in the north. And so this is a little bit of a walk back from the previous Russian position. It seems like something that should really be considered in the West. And we got some maybe positive comments from the vice president. So I want to break down what J.D. Vance has to say. Let's start with this first clip.
To your point about weapons, what we said to the Europeans is simply, first of all, this is in your neck of the woods. This is in your back door. You guys have got to step up and take a bigger role in this thing. And if you care so much about this conflict, you should be willing to play a more direct and a more substantial way in funding this war yourself. I think the president, and I certainly think that America, we're done with the funding of the Ukraine war business. We want to bring about a peaceful settlement to this thing. We want to stop the killing. But Americans, I think, are sick of continuing to send their money, their tax dollars to this particular conflict. But if the Europeans want to step up and actually buy the weapons from American producers, we're okay with that, but we're not going to fund it ourselves anymore.
So this sounds good, right? He's saying that we're not going to fund the war anymore, and that if the proxy war is going to continue, it'll be funded by the Europeans buying American weapons. I think the first problem here is it shows that there's still, this is, I think, one of the more educated people in the White House on this issue. Certainly, I would imagine the closest person to Donald Trump at this point that has a firm grasp on this issue. In fact, today, when the Europeans, Zelensky, and Trump were all holding a call, Vance was scheduled to be on that call with Donald Trump. And so it does seem that the vice president has a real role and a real say when it comes to Ukraine policy. But he, like Donald Trump, just keeps pointing to the funding as being the issue, not the fact that we've depleted our stockpiles and we don't have more weapons to send to the Ukrainians. This is crucial, right? Even if the Europeans are buying these weapons for Ukraine, we don't have the weapons to give them. I really fear that this means that if the Europeans are willing to buy American weapons, that we're going to have to give them upgraded or more advanced weapons, longer range weapons, as the Ukrainians continue to lose, that we're going to have to escalate our support for Ukraine. And Trump may be willing to do that if it's not the Americans paying for it. And so we really cannot get hung up on the funding. Yes, this is huge, right? This was $175 billion of American taxpayer money that was spent. And it probably a hell of a lot more than that. That's even with their budgetary tricks. But even that number, it's absolutely disgusting that our government robbed us to send all this money to a foreign country over an issue that could have been resolved before it even started in the opening months of this war. It never had to happen and go down like this. But the ultimate, I think, concern of Americans at this point should be more the other consequences of this war, the depleting of the American stockpile, the erosion of diplomacy, and the near absence of diplomacy between Washington and Moscow, the world's two largest superpowers, the destruction of arms control agreements, particularly nuclear arms control agreements. These are issues that must be addressed that are even more important than the war in Ukraine. And if Vance's position is, it's fine if the Europeans are paying for it, shows just a very immature way, a very top line way of looking at this conflict and not understanding the deeper problems here. Now, I guess a second point to what Vance is saying there that I did find to be interesting is just overall that he's saying and seems to recognize that the American people are done with this, which does mean there has to be a negotiated settlement and a real end to this conflict. It's not something that could just be drug out. Now I have one more clip of Vance to play, so next clip, Chris.
You did not want to send taxpayer dollars to Ukraine and taxpayer funded arms to Ukraine. Do you feel that the current state of affairs improve that, whereas the U.S. will sell weapons to NATO countries and they will go ahead and send the weapons?
Well, two things on that. First of all, I think the reason that we reached this decisive moment, a real change in where we were, is because the president was willing to apply some significant pressure and actually say, if you don't come to the table, the American people, we're not going to get involved in this war directly. But we have a lot of economic points of leverage, and we're willing to use those to bring about peace. And that was a big thing that happened.
So I wanted to play this clip and point this out because, again, I think it shows another fundamental misunderstanding that J.D. Vance has here. And I think this mentality is going to make it so that Trump cannot be successful in Alaska. Vance, Trump think that Putin is coming to us, that they are, the ones that are asking for a reprieve here, when in reality, it's the Ukrainians who are losing this war. And the Russians have some very stiff demands, and maybe they've backed off from them some, but I don't think they should interpret Russia willing to make some concessions to bring a diplomatic end to this war as Russia feeling that they're in a corner, that Russia is weak. I think Putin is making a calculation here. I think a part of Putin's calculation is he knows that no matter how decent the offer that he made was to the Ukrainians, that Zelensky was never going to accept it. that he was never going to allow Putin to even if he was willing to give up Zaporizhia and Kherson. Zelensky says time and time again that we're not going to give up even the Donbass, which is firmly Russian territory. Nobody could even dispute that. They were autonomous since 2014. Kiev hasn't been able to control this region for over a decade, and Zelensky is demanding to end this war, that Russia completely withdraw from there. It is an absolutely absurd and stupid demand. But so Putin, by making this offer, by sitting down with Donald Trump, I think is going to look very good on the world stage. That this is a man who, even though he holds the cards right now, as Trump would say, in Ukraine, even as Russian forces are advancing, even as he could potentially cause the collapse of the Ukrainian military, overthrow the Ukrainian government, their air defense is absolutely porous at this point. The Russians could inflict a heavy blow on the Ukrainians. And this is going to be the perception of the world, that at this time, Putin then went to the United States and tried to make a very reasonable offer, and either Trump or Zelensky said no. And I think there's kind of one of two ways this is going to go. Either Trump is going to respond by trying to ramp up the economic pressure on Russia, which isn't going to work, or I think another real potential response to all of this is Trump gets very annoyed with Zelensky for not taking what even he sees as a very reasonable offer, and something that Ukraine could accept and end this conflict without future bloodshed. And that could maybe damage the special relationship that Washington has with Kiev. Now, Trump has some interesting things to say about this, so let's play this next clip from Trump.
Mr. President, how were your calls this morning with European leaders, and was it your call not to invite President Zelensky to your meeting with Putin?
No, just the opposite. No. We had a very good call. He was on the call. President Zelensky was on the call. I would rate it a 10, very, very friendly. It was always going to be, I was going to meet with President Putin, and then after that, I'm going to call the leaders and President Zelensky. I'm going to call President Zelensky, and then I'll call, probably in that order, the leaders. There's a very good chance that we're going to have a second meeting, which will be more productive than the first, because the first is I'm going to find out where we are and what we're doing. Again, this is Biden's war. This isn't my war. He got us into this thing. We're going to meet with, I would say, the second meeting. If the first one goes okay, we'll have a quick second one. I would like to do it almost immediately, and we'll have a quick second meeting between President Putin and President Zelensky and myself, if they'd like to have me there. And that would be a meeting where maybe it could be absolutely work. But the first meeting will not work that out. Certain great things can be gained in the first. It's going to be a very important meeting. But it's setting the table for the second meeting. I think the second meeting, if the second meeting takes place, now there may be no second meeting, because if I feel that it's not appropriate to have it because I didn't get the answers that we have to have, then we're not going to have a second meeting.
Okay, so that's Donald Trump in full on Trump form there. And I will say, I thought in a bright spot here, he does seem to have reasonable expectations for what could come from the meeting with Putin on Friday. That he doesn't expect there to be some grand ceasefire or bargain at this meeting, that Putin and him aren't going to walk away shaking hands in an official end to this conflict, and understanding that this is a meeting to feel out the two sides, to trade proposals, to go back to Washington, to go back to Moscow, to figure out, what we could ultimately do to try to hammer out, you made some concessions here, we made some concessions there. Again, there's plenty for these two sides to negotiate on. And even if they, I think would be important, have discussions on issues outside of the war in Ukraine. Extending or resuming nuclear and arms control pads would be absolutely huge. Restoring embassy staff and consulates in each other's countries, again, absolutely huge. Maybe removing some limited sanctions so Russia's diplomatic facilities in the United States could function more on a normal basis. There's plenty of really important steps that can be taken at this meeting, even excluding the Ukraine issue. And so, maybe some minor victories like that. But overall, I think Donald Trump is doing a very good job of tempering expectations of any grand bargain coming out of this meeting. And I'm glad that he doesn't expect one. Now, that he expects the next meeting to concern Zelensky and it to really be a bilateral meeting between Zelensky and Putin, and that it's going to happen rather quickly, doesn't necessarily seem like a reasonable expectation to me. I think Putin would probably be happy having a second meeting between the two leaders, where maybe they try to move a little bit closer towards a deal, unless they're already very close after the first meeting, before Zelensky's included in the talks, before they really get into and trying to hammer out an official end to this. But Zelensky's making it very clear that even if Trump and Putin walked away with a really, really good foundation for an agreement from the first meeting, that he's just going to blow it up anyways. So this next video, it is Zelensky speaking Ukrainian. So again, AI dubbed into English. Let's play this next clip of the Ukrainian leader.
Volodymyr Zelensky, Putin is bluffing. He is trying to put pressure on all fronts of the Ukrainian front before the meeting in Alaska. Russia is trying to make it look like they are capable of occupying all of Ukraine. Of course, that's what they want. Yes, it's true, Russia has several times more weapons, especially artillery, 3 times as much and things like that. But Russia also has 3 times more losses, and that's a fact. I told my colleagues and the President of the United States, as well as our European friends, that Putin definitely does not want peace. He wants to occupy our country. And we all truly understand this. Putin won't be able to fool anyone.
So one thing I wanted to highlight in this statement that I think is really important, that Zelensky says Russia has multiple times the manpower, they're producing multiple times the weapons, and they want to take all of Ukraine. Well, if that's the case, if that's the situation, and Putin comes to you and offers to end the war, taking less than 20% of Ukraine, then that's a massive victory. He's very, very well short of his goals if that's the case. You should absolutely take this deal. And yet Zelensky is saying that any agreement that's negotiated between Trump and Putin is stillborn. He's saying that he won't cede any of the Donbass even to Russia. His views at this point are absolutely, in demands to end the war, are completely out of sync with the reality of the situation on the ground in Ukraine whatsoever. And ultimately, I think this really lowers the chance of any kind of success or momentum building from the Alaska talks, unless maybe if Trump and Putin say put the Ukraine issue somewhat on the back burner for the Washington-Moscow relationship and just try to restore weapons or something like that. But generally speaking, I don't think anything is going to come of the Alaska meeting, because Zelensky is sure to blow up and reject whatever agreement comes about. So last up here, we have a clip from our old friend Lindsey Graham explaining that once Ukraine, if Trump negotiates a good deal to end the war in Ukraine, there goes Taiwan.
No, I'm very okay with President Trump meeting with President Putin in Alaska. I think everybody knows that how this war ends can be a good thing or a bad thing. If it ends in a way, it looks like that Putin's overly rewarded, there goes Taiwan. You can't end a war without talking. I do hope that Zelensky can be part of the process. I'll leave that up to the White House, but I have every confidence in the world that the president is going to go to meet Putin from a position of strength, that he's going to look out for Europe and Ukrainian needs to end this war honorably, and it's time to end this war honorably. But how we do it will be historical.
So this man, obviously an absolute clown. We all know that he doesn't understand the situation, or if he does, that's almost even worse. If he understands the poor shape that the Ukrainian military is in, how desperate the country is, and the offer that's on the table right now that will, allow Ukraine to keep Odessa, its Black Sea port, and, retain much of its sovereignty and territory. That deal is on the table right now, and it can be taken. And, Graham here is pretty much demanding that Russia pass on it. Now, one of the reasons I love playing clips from Lindsey Graham is because he says explains the position I hate in the absolutely least intelligent way possible by just saying, if we make a deal for the war in Ukraine, up there goes Taiwan. But his oversimplified explanation is often an explanation of the consensus establishment thinking in Washington D.C. There's a reason that they bring Lindsey Graham on these Sunday morning news shows every week to explain foreign policy to the American people, because he represents the consensus on foreign policy, the establishment, the deep state in Washington. And so he is saying what other people are writing in papers and are saying far more in an articulate way on different shows and things like that. But they really do believe that somehow Ukraine should be a model for Taiwan, that we need to turn Taiwan into a Ukraine, and that this is a similar situation. And even more, I think mistakenly, they think that if they give up in Ukraine, it's going to be a signal for China to take Taiwan. When in reality, as we've talked about time and time again on this show, the West has a real problem in their arsenals. Their depots are depleted because of all the weapons that they have sent to Ukraine. And so if you want to deter China from attacking Taiwan, then you got to be able to have the weapons to send to Taiwan if they're attacked. And at this point, there's not many to send. And so that should be a real problem and a real concern. But this is really just about justifying every single war and never giving up on any single war, making every argument for every single war. And, it should be revealing to Donald Trump when people like Lindsey Graham start to disagree with them and say that we have to worry about Europe's and Ukraine's interests in order to end this war. No, Donald Trump is the American first president. That's what people liked about him. We are done with using our money and our empire to constantly try to help other people. And, it never ends up helping anyone. The people of Iraq or Afghanistan or Syria or Libya, Somalia, Yemen, none of them are better off because of American intervention. And the American people know this, right? It didn't help the United States in any way. They don't like us more in any of those countries because of our interventions there. And I'm sure the Ukrainian people won't when they realize that had Joe Biden just told Donald Trump in December of 2021, you're right, Ukraine is never going to join NATO. We'll make it official NATO policy that Ukraine is not going to join this alliance. This war would have never happened. The Donbass, Kherson, Zaporizhia, all of it would have been part of Ukraine. They wouldn't have lost hundreds of thousands of soldiers. They wouldn't have lost so much of their infrastructure, so many refugees, many of whom will never return. Ukraine will always be, a state less than what it could have been because of the war and because of Joe Biden's refusal to negotiate a perfectly reasonable agreement with Vladimir Putin before it happened. And once the Ukrainian people realize that, once they realize that in the time, the leaders in the West were almost salivating, they were almost ecstatic that Putin had made, in their view, such a blunder to get involved in a quagmire in a neighboring country where Russia, I'm sure, has spent hundreds of billions of dollars, lost tens of thousands, if not more, of their soldiers, so many injuries, PTSD, all the things that plagued the United States after, our misadventures in the Middle East. Those are all going to be consequences that Russia has to live with down the road. They wanted to give Russia another Afghanistan. They wanted to draw them into a quagmire where they would bleed Russia. They're trying to overextend and weaken Russia. This is Ukraine. The Ukrainian people are used as a pawn in all of this, and they have suffered and lost so much from all of this. And our leaders orchestrated it. They're behind it. And that's why, now we just need to bring this thing to a close. Stop the dying in Ukraine. No more of this just bleeding Russia at the expense of the Ukrainians. It has to end now. All right, everybody, that will conclude today's show. Thank you so much for tuning in. If you're still listening, give us a thumbs up, like, repost if you're listening on X. And of course, the best thing you could do to help out the channel is subscribe to the YouTube channel and recommend it to others. Thanks, everyone. We'll be back with Comic Dave Smith tomorrow at 4:45 Eastern.